Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, this week we have discussion on international relations. Particularly, we are trying to understand the diplomacy. What's its different connotation, interpretation, and how one country uses diplomacy as a tool to improve the relationship between two countries, say bilateral relations, multilateral relations, and how the different scenario, different changes at political, economic level have impact on diplomacy. We have tried to understand in the last lecture. Today we will move further and we will try to understand, explore the different types of diplomacy, and also will see the recent development which has happened at the level of diplomacy at different stages. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in studio Dr. Aparajita Kashyap. She teaches international relations at Guru Gobind Singh Press University, and her area of interest is diplomacy and international relations. So on behalf, I welcome her for EduSet lecture on this topic. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would be continuing with my last lecture. In the last lecture, I basically introduced the aspects of diplomacy. That is, what is diplomacy, the meaning, the definition, the types of diplomacy, its functions, its role. And today, I actually begin with describing what is traditional diplomacy. I would like to recapitulate that traditional diplomacy. I would be moving to new diplomacy, and then I would also be talking about the recent current trends in diplomacy. What are the recent developments? How is the diplomatic scenario changing? It is not now a state-centric activity. There are other non-state actors also involved. So the focus of today's discussion would be basically moving on into the 20th century, early 20th century, Cold War diplomacy, post-Cold War diplomacy, recent diplomacy, and then I would be quoting examples as and when to prove how diplomacy has changed over the years. Now, beginning with diplomacy, as I told you, how to distinguish between the different types of diplomacy, there are certain parameters that we take into account. The first parameter is the structure, that is, how actors, what are the different actors involved in diplomacy. Second thing that we look at are the processes, the methods in which diplomacy is organized. And the third thing, these three parameters are taken into consideration when we describe the different types of diplomacy. What are the agenda or the issues that are taken up while discussing diplomacy? So keeping these parameters in mind, the different types of diplomacy, I am just repeating what I had done in the last, I had said in the last lecture. The first is open or secret diplomacy. Open meaning that the proceedings are taking place in open. They are open to public scrutiny. People are witness to this diplomatic procedure. Whereas the other type of diplomacy is called secret diplomacy, which is proceeding in camera. The proceedings are held in total secrecy because the contents of the meetings do not have to be leaked out, and maybe later then the outcomes of the meeting are disclosed, or they are read out, or they are released. So this is the difference between open or secret diplomacy. If we look at open diplomacy, one thing is very clear. If there are large number of actors involved, it is very difficult to keep that procedure secretive. Therefore, there is a likelihood that the procedure will become open, or the matters or aspects that have been discussed will be disclosed. Now, if it is a bilateral meeting, that is the traditional method of diplomacy, bilateral meeting, only two actors are involved, then there is a chance that the discussions and outcomes can be kept secretive. So, secretive, but there are times when in modern diplomacy also we use the secretive method. The second type of diplomacy is called private diplomacy or public diplomacy. Whether the actor involved is a private individual or is he a nominee of the government. For example, Nixon would often rely on Henry Kissinger, I told in the last class. Therefore, a private diplomacy is when one person or an agent, or for example, Jimmy Carter is said to be one man army doing diplomatic activities and solving problems in so many African countries. And whether it is public diplomacy means when there are agents of the government involved, it is an official procedure, official representatives of states are negotiating. Then the third type of diplomacy is called pure diplomacy or mixed diplomacy. Now pure means when diplomacy started, it was only concerned about political aspects, about physical security, physically securing the territory of a nation state. Because more often than not, there were issues of war and conflicts, and there were border issues or there were citizenship issues, and they had to be solved by security or military issues, military methods. So this is pure diplomacy, when only politics is used and the idea is only to secure physical security. Whereas mixed diplomacy, in the changing scenario, what has happened is politics is not enough. Politics is also about society, it is also about economy, it is also about human rights, it is about environment. So when we mixed a series of aspects into concluding a meeting or into bringing about diplomatic activity, it is called mixed diplomacy. So if we were to summarize, mixed diplomacy would include politics, society or social issues, economics, environment, then subversion, all these kind of techniques which are used is mixed diplomacy. The next type of diplomacy is called traditional or new diplomacy. So when we say traditional diplomacy, what we mean is, though that diplomacy which was practiced after the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, when nation states were formed, and when there were only these were newly emerging economies, the arena of diplomacy was localized to Europe, and there were only big powers who were talking and negotiating. Whereas new diplomacy, the arena shifted out of Europe. There was a process of decolonization. Other countries were becoming important. There was major spate of decolonization, especially in Asia, Africa and Latin America. And because of this, you had independent and new nation states, smaller powers though, in different parts of the continent. And because of this phenomena, then the new diplomacy included a host of actors, a large number of actors. There were people who were not even people from political backgrounds. These were people who were from the bureaucracy, or they were career diplomats. They were negotiating, they were trained in the process of negotiation. I will go into details of new diplomacy. And then we had the Cold War, the period after the Second World War and before the disintegration of Soviet Union. The Cold War period had a typical kind of diplomacy, because the world was characterized by ideological conflicts between it was called East and West, but the ideological conflict was between capitalism and communism. And the post-Cold War scenario, post-Cold War diplomacy, when Soviet Union disintegrates, then there is disintegration of Yugoslavia, the first Gulf War breaks out, and in this scenario then how does diplomacy change? So I am going to go into the details of the different types, and as I told you, I have already done this. Traditional diplomacy, it was typically a communication process between the different states. So the actors were states, sovereign states and their agents. There were specialized institutions. These institutions had already emerged by 16th century. You had embassies or resident missions. There were professional diplomats in different countries. They were trained in the art of negotiation. The process was bilateral, mostly involving two countries, how to solve problems between two countries. It was secretive, because there were only two actors, it was easy to keep the mission secret. It was based on the mutual agreement between the two actors for settling disputes, because there was no way that these disputes could be settled. Diplomatic protocols were established. Diplomatic protocols are laid down procedures and rules on how to conclude treaties, on how to negotiate, what treatment to extend to the diplomats, and this comes 15th century onwards. things like extraterritoriality was introduced. Extraterritoriality is the concept when the premises of an embassy in another country is treated like the home territory of the parent country. Therefore, supposing the US embassy in India within the boundaries or premises of the United States territory, the laws and rules of the Indian government would not run. The laws and rules of the United States would be followed. And as I told you, this process was very, very typically Europe, because Europe was the first continent where modern nation states were emerging. So this was very, very European centric procedure. The agenda, as I told you, was bilateral. There were only two actors involved. There were issues of physical security being discussed, because that time we had no notion of economic cooperation or environmental cooperation, or there were no notion of nuclear problems. And issues, more often than not, they reflected the personal ambitions of the rulers. For example, I quoted yesterday also the Henry Wotton, the Elizabethan diplomat. He would often say that a diplomat is a person who goes and lies on behalf of the rulers, and in that lying he has to be so true in lying that he reflects the agenda and mission of his monarch or the leader of his country, and it is not his viewpoint which is being expressed there. So he is basically an ambassador or an agent of his government. Now, moving on from traditional diplomacy, when we come to new diplomacy, we see that it is a phenomena which is typically early 20th century, and I told you 19th century was called the century of peace in Europe because wars were declining. But 20th century, early 20th century, we saw the two major world wars, and especially the traditional diplomacy. The First World War happened, inevitable. Second World War could have been prevented. The traditional diplomacy failed to prevent the Second World War, and therefore we had to redesign the process of diplomacy. There were mainly two reasons for emergence of new diplomacy. One was that there was a demand the world over that diplomacy should be more open to public scrutiny and control, and it should also reflect the public opinion. Therefore, there was so much of pressure on the governments that they had to redefine the paradigms of diplomacy. And the second requirement was that the importance of creating a world organization to negotiate the problems was felt, and that is how the League of Nations was devised. And the idea behind formation of international organizations was that these would then take collective action against potential aggressors. But the entire mandate of League of Nations failed, and even this collective action issue or a formation of an international organization started being questioned. Looking into the structure of the new diplomacy, there are certain important parameters which have changed. I am just taking into consideration those parameters which have changed and shifted. There are new aspects of communication between states. It is not only about political agreements, it is more about economic agreements. There are social agreements, there are immigration issues which are happening, there are environmental problems between countries, and then the countries have to take steps. Therefore, these are the new aspects of communication. There are new institutions which are coming up, because the traditional institutions were not geared up to handle the newly emerging problems, things like human rights and environment or nuclear issues. So you had coming up of human rights group, environmental groups, NGOs which are taking up specific issues. There are new procedures which are being devised, that initially the traditional diplomacy was only specifically an activity which was confined to interaction between states. Now new procedures that we are not now only state centric activity, diplomacy goes beyond state centrism, and there are non-state actors also involved. There are intergovernmental organizations, there are international organizations, social activists who get involved. So these are new procedures. And then we are also strengthening the network of embassies. They are becoming well established, well proliferated embassies, and there's a huge network of embassies throughout the world. The process, as we see, because the number of actors is proliferating, it is not only the state actors, as I told you, there are growing number of international organizations, then there are intergovernmental organizations, there are non-state actors in addition to states. So there are multiple actors. So to hold on to multiple actors, then it becomes difficult, because the agenda, the expectations of the outcome, then how they are going to negotiate, the negotiating techniques of the different groups or actors are totally different. Secret deliberations were taking place because there were certain essential areas in which you could not deliberate in open. There were open deliberations as well, but there were secret deliberations, but the outcomes of the deliberations were open. The most important process change was that the new diplomacy wasn't confined to Europe per se. It goes beyond Europe, it goes to the other continent, it goes to continents like Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the earlier issues that I said were low politics issues. Low politics issues are things like human rights, something like economics. These are low politics issues, but till now the low politics issues were not figuring anywhere in the diplomatic procedure. What they were discussing still was the high politics issues. High politics issues means military issues, then economics issues, things which have high weightage are basically high politics issues. The agenda, of course, was multilateral. It had moved beyond bilateralism. It wasn't between two countries. There were more than two actors involved. The complex issue was, the complexity of the procedure was due to the involvement of many issues and many actors. As I told you, no two issues were alike, no two actors had the same outlook, no two actors had expectations of the same outcome. Therefore, it was a mishmash or a web of actors and issues that were involved. And then in this changing scenario, there was a clear-cut reflection of the changing role of the diplomats. Their competence had to be changed, and now clearly you could see that these diplomats were more focused, more aggressive, they were trained in the skill of diplomacy, and their competence was very, very high. And this was a prerequisite for the complex procedure and the changing paradigm of diplomacy. Now, if we compare the new and old diplomacy, then there are certain things, and I would like you to look at the table which I have prepared. New and old diplomacy, if you compare, so all these facts will become very open and it will become very clear. Old diplomacy was essentially European, whereas new was more universal and widespread. Old was bilateral, whereas the new diplomacy became a multilateral negotiation. Old involved only the big powers of Europe and US, of course, whereas the new diplomacy included big and small powers from all over the world. The monarch was sovereign, the representative, the diplomat was a representative of the monarch who was sovereign. So, he did not represent a state, whereas in the new diplomacy, sovereign had constitutional status. Therefore, the diplomat was representing his country which had constitutional sovereignty. Then the states and their representatives were the main actors in old diplomacy, whereas the new diplomacy had plethora of actors like IOs, international organizations, international governmental organizations, then state actors, non-state actors like NGOs, human rights activists. Then the the next point of comparison is the agenda. The agenda was based on conservative issues demonstrating the vision and interest of the ruler. So, as I told you, Henry Wotton's observation becomes very true, that it is conservative and it is only reflecting the vision of the ruler. whereas the new diplomacy had newer agendas like human rights, environment and economic issues. The process was secretive, whereas the new diplomacy, it was an open procedure. The old one reflected flexibility in negotiation, that is, the diplomat was free, he could go there looking at the situation, he could devise his own rules, he could change and suit his position to the requirement of the current times or of the situation. But in the new diplomacy, there were definite rules for negotiations. There was a protocol, there was a treaty, there was an agreement, there were procedures in which to negotiate. So the diplomat in the modern day or new diplomacy, he had to abide by those rules and guidelines. Then the diplomats had discretion, definitely, because he was not rule bound, he had his discretion to use and solve issues in his own way if at times what he was fed wasn't enough, so he could devise his own solution. But the diplomats here had to follow instructions from the Foreign Office, their own Ministry of External Affairs or Ministry of Home Affairs would be guiding them on how to negotiate, on what matters to discuss. Then the diplomats they were very friendly, they were humane, they were polite, whereas the new diplomats, because these are career diplomats who have been trained and hardened in diplomacy, they were more professional and more aggressive. They would call a spade, they would not mince words. Now, the newer diplomacy then moved on towards, it is a form, Cold War diplomacy is a form of new world diplomacy, but there was a line from where Cold War diplomacy emerges, and this is typically after the end of the Second World War. After the Second World War, that is late 1940s until the end of 1980s, we had a new type of diplomacy which was called Cold War diplomacy. This area, this region, this regime or this period was marked by ideological confrontations between USA and USSR. Then Cold War diplomacy again was a multilateral procedure, because there were sympathizers of USSR, people in the Soviet bloc, and there were people in the US bloc. So it wasn't a two country negotiation, it was more often than not a multilateral negotiation. Then there were increasing number of specialized agendas that diplomats were looking at. The agendas were multifarious, they were diversifying, they were multiplying. Then, but nonetheless, the rules and principles were being revised, they were being rewritten, and especially the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, there were established rules and procedures of diplomacy that were written, they were written clearly, and diplomacy, rules and procedures of diplomacy were given the status of international law. So here after there is clear-cut codification of rules and behaviors of diplomats, and this is why diplomacy is equated as an aspect of international law. The agenda, what was the agenda? The most important agenda was avoiding the East-West confrontation. East-West means capitalist versus communist confrontation, and we had the Iron Curtain separating the East and the West, and any time the war would break out, it was a situation, Cold War was a situation just short of hot war, where the two countries were in confrontation, and the confrontation came out of ideology. For example, US wanted to halt the march of communism, and they thought that they would lose in a domino effect one country after another to communism, and that is why US then went as far as Vietnam and Korea to intervene, because they thought that all these countries would be under the coming under the fold of communism. So this is the agenda, that is avoid East-West confrontation. Then the other agenda was that now most of the countries were nuclear weapon possessing countries. Therefore, there were chances that, because we had a Pearl Harbor, so after that the countries went on a spree of nuclear weapon building phase. So there had to be possibility of a global nuclear conflict, and we could not afford that. So the agenda was, of course, to avoid global nuclear conflict that could destroy the entire international system. Then there were I told you that new diplomacy, they were mostly discussing high politics aspect. Now, in addition to the high politics aspect, we started discussing the new low politics issues. These were issues related to political, social as well as economic aspects. So, military was not the main concern, or physical security was not the main concern. We moved beyond those concerns. We were talking about political cooperations, we are talking about social cooperations or economic cooperations. Now, the agenda, one important agenda was also to strike a harmony between hard and soft power. Now, what is a hard power? Hard power is all those elements of power which are targeted, immediate, coercive and physical. And soft power. Soft power are all those aspects of power which are indirect, they are persuasive and they are made with a long term impact in mind or long term solution in mind. Therefore, there had to be a harmony between hard power and soft power. So, these were the important agenda of the Cold War diplomacy. So, there were then with time, as because it was from 1940s to 1980s, more specifically till 1991, there were so many events unfolding, there were so many developments taking place in the world that this Cold War diplomacy then further bifurcated into different kinds of diplomacy. The first was called nuclear diplomacy. Now, what is a nuclear diplomacy? Because as I told you, most of the countries started possessing or developing their own nuclear weapons. So, when you had nuclear armed states interacting, we had to be extra cautious. So, this diplomacy was devised with two things in mind, and these are the two aspects of nuclear diplomacy. The first aspect is called deterrence. That is, deterrence is create a fear. So, you dissuade an opponent from undertaking an action. So, he will think twice before he uses his nuclear weapon. You create such a fear in him. And the second technique is called compellence. Compellence is that some country has already started an action, the action has already begun. So, you ask that country to take back the activity that it is doing. So, it is like a curative thing. The disease has already spread and you are trying to cure that disease, whereas deterrence is like a preventive disease. Then during the 1960s, we had very important developments. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which is called almost the Third World War. The world had never come so close to a war. US and the issue goes that there was a missile build-up in Cuba, one of the friendly countries of United States USSR. Now, a US spy plane U-2 on a reconnaissance mission, they spotted the nuclear buildup, and then a whole lot of activities take place. US stops all ships which are westbound from crossing a particular line. They decide a line and they say that no ships could cross this line without being physically frisked. So, because the presumption was that all the ships which are moving towards Cuba are carrying missiles from USSR, and then there were a whole lot of activities and negotiations and diplomacy that was taking place, and this resulted ultimately in solving the crisis, and the world was liberated, or they were thankful, the world was thankful that a third world war did not take place. So, this is called crisis diplomacy. The role of Khrushchev and Kissinger was very, very important. Now, crisis diplomacy defined is a delicate communication and negotiation involved in the crisis that could escalate into a nuclear war, and the example I have clearly given you. Now, this was not enough. The East and West, USA and USSR were always in confrontation with each other. They would never agree. So, there were no way that the solution could come. What happened was, as a result of the crisis diplomacy in Cuba, there was a hotline which was established between Washington and Moscow. So the moment the telephone would be picked up in Moscow, the other side would definitely be the presidential office in Washington. The idea was to cut out the time and the intervention or the different actors in between. They had to talk one to one. So then what the world decided was that this ideological conflict will have repercussions throughout, and therefore there must be some method devised to bring this to an end. So we decided on summit diplomacy. Now summit diplomacy is a diplomacy. Summit means peak. So summit diplomacy means the heads of the government would meet, and in one-to-one meetings. So this is a direct meeting between heads of government, especially the superpowers. So the two presidents of United States and the USSR would often meet, and they would be discussing issues like, for example, SALT, strategic arms limitation talk, strategic arms reduction treaties. All these were the outcome of the summit meetings between the different leaders, the two leaders. Now we come to the post-Cold War diplomacy. Now 1991, disintegration of 1990s, disintegration of Yugoslavia, 1991 specifically USSR disintegrated. So the ideological conflict ends. There is no clash between USA and USSR. The world moves from bipolarism to unipolarism to multipolarism, and this is now 21st century. The end of our ideological conflict between East and West, it leads to formation of new paradigms, redefinition of written rules, and of course there were two other important events. Apart from demise of Soviet Union, there were two other important events. One was disintegration of Yugoslavia, which changed the entire European scenario, and the second was the first Gulf War, when Iraq was evicted from Kuwait. So these were things which led to redefining diplomacy. The agenda was global. The issues were no longer, see, US intervening in Middle East, okay, US intervening in Asia. So the arena of diplomacy had shifted. It had become a global procedure. North-South dimension was added. So earlier we had the East-West conflict, now we have a North-South dimension. North-South meaning the developed and the developing countries. And because it involved multiple actors, multiple processes and multiple agenda, the issue became complex and fragmented. We did not have a set rule. As and when the rule would require, we would form a diplomatic mission, we would discuss issues, because the whole process was fragmented. Simultaneously there would be different meetings being held, and the outcomes would then be merged and a report would be read out. So this was fragmentation of the entire procedure of diplomacy. And of course the agenda of issues became wider. As I told you, we were discussing high politics with low politics, we were discussing soft power with hard power, we were discussing environment with nuclear policies. So the agenda was proliferating. The structure more or less, it had been established that we had permanent diplomacies, we have permanent embassies, there are a category of hierarchy of diplomatic staff, there are envoys, there are ambassadors, there are high commissioners, and the structure was almost the same since 15th century. It has we have had diplomatic missions and envoys, and the procedure was complex, multilateral, bilateral, multilateral as well as bilateral. There were certain issues on which two countries would negotiate. There were certain aspects on which there would be multilateral negotiations. So the structure also was defined like that. If it was a multilateral negotiation, smaller formalities, less of formalities, a mutually agreeable venue would be taken up. If it was a multilateral negotiation, then there were more formalities, there were more procedural aspects to look into, then the venue had to be decided accordingly. Now coming to the post-Cold War diplomacy, if we try to bifurcate into different kinds of diplomacy that we are talking, there were different diplomacies. First is called developmental diplomacy. Now, early 20th century, decolonization, let's call it mid 20th century, 1950s onward, 50 onwards, lot of decolonization was taking place, and because of that, newly emerged countries were coming up. They wanted to participate in the process of diplomacy, but these were third world countries, they were developing economies. So whenever an economy tries to negotiate its position or assert its position in a diplomatic procedure, this is called developmental diplomacy. That is, the third world countries are trying to bargain in order to improve their position vis-a-vis the developed world. Second is called peacekeeping diplomacy. Now, peacekeeping diplomacy became very important because there were so many civil conflicts throughout the world, and because these were new democracies, they were not competent to handle or sort out their civil conflicts. So what they did was they invited observers or peacekeepers, and the most important role in the peacekeeper was that of the United Nations. And there were economic aids, there would be humanitarian assistance, there would be food aid in the name of peacekeeping. And then the third important development, and this is post 9/11, was counter-terrorism diplomacy, which is to look into the war on terror. Bush doctrine had clearly specified that we had to counter terrorism, and for this we could launch a war on terror. So counter-terrorism diplomacy became very important. So whenever there was a negotiation, when there was a linkage to any kind of terrorist activity, the US would take the lead role, and it would go and negotiate, or it would try to use diplomatic machines. More often than not, it was trying to intrude into the country which was harboring terrorists. This is counter-terrorist activities. And then you had cultural diplomacy, when cultural agents or the instrument of culture was used to win over other countries, or to negotiate, or to recommend healthy relationship between two countries. We were using the media of culture. For example, we have lot of India Festival of India in France, or Festival of India in England. All this is taking place in order to have diplomatic relationship through the use of culture. Then there was another kind of diplomacy with which Laura Bush, wife of George Bush Sr., is involved. This is called cookie diplomacy. Cookie diplomacy was this word was typically coined in the context of Afghanistan for rehabilitation and resettlement of the war affected children and women. Laura Bush would maybe distribute cookies, hence the name, but no, in fact she was trying to put them to school. She was trying to rehabilitate them and to bring the trauma of war out of them, and this is the technique that she was using, cookie diplomacy. Now, there is another concept which has come up, especially in the relationship between India and Pakistan, and that is called sports diplomacy. We use sports as a means of influence. Cricket, especially hockey, all these are used in order to influence the or improve the relationship between two countries, and it is often used in the context of cricket, especially the Indo-Pak matches that we have. You start giving visa, you start inviting guests from Pakistan, or vice versa, then Indian guests go to Pakistan to witness matches. So this is called sports diplomacy. There is another kind of diplomacy, is citizen diplomacy, when you allow the citizens, the common citizens, to take part in diplomacy, or you take opinion, public opinion from them, and you use their inputs or feedbacks in forming agreements or in doing certain kind of diplomatic behavior. So this is called citizen diplomacy. Or for example, you can have some eminent citizen who could go on behalf of the Indian government and can put the views of Indian government abroad. This is called citizen diplomacy. And then most importantly, is the track 1 and track 2 diplomacy, a term which is very, very often used, especially in the context of India-Pakistan, India-China relationship. What is track 1 diplomacy? Now, the diplomatic activities in official capacity can be taken on behalf of the state or intergovernmental organizations. When I say intergovernmental organizations, I am specifically focusing at EU, United Nations, or Organization of African Union, now called the African Union, AU. Now, these diplomats are acting in official capacity, so they have fixed agenda, they have fixed procedure on how to go about these diplomatic techniques. They have direct stake in the dispute. So, whatever is the outcome or whatever is the dispute involved, the government is directly involved. And it is a very routine procedure, because this is what diplomacy is all about. There are certain rules. A country will go to another country in a fixed period of time, they will go, they will negotiate, they will talk, it may be inconclusive talks, they will come back, they will write a report, then again there will be meetings. So, this is a very, very routine procedure. Mediation and incentives are also given, that is, there is a third party. Mediation is typically when a third party gets involved, because the two parties are at loggerheads, they cannot come to any agreement. So, we need a mediator, a third party, and the third party will negotiate. It will try to bring the two parties together, then it will try to give a solution to the problem, and you may take it or you may not take it, but at least he is helping you solve the problem. Then there are certain incentives also given, that if the issue is solved, then these will be the advantages and these will be the incentives, or these are going to be the SOPs which are to be given. So, this is track 1 diplomacy, and its important is mostly during peacekeeping and peacemaking. Now, contrasted to track 1 diplomacy is the track 2 diplomacy. Now, track 2 diplomacy, as the name suggests, it is an advancement over 1. Therefore, track 2 had certain features which were not there in track 1. Like, rather than using government representatives, informal channels are used. The governments have failed to negotiate, especially in the case of India and Pakistan, or India and China. What is happening is that the formal channels, we have tried all formal channels, we have tried government representatives, we have tried sending the diplomatic envoys, but things have failed. So, we start using the informal channels. The NGOs, regional organizations or grassroots workers are involved. There are back channel discussions, there are workshops which are conducted, there are confidence building measures which are undertaken, there are joint working groups which meet, so that the formality of the procedure is taken out and people have the feeling that formality didn't work, maybe informal procedure will work. And here the idea is conflict prevention and peace building, and not peacekeeping, but conflict prevention and peace building. This is how it differs from track 1 diplomacy. Track 1 diplomacy is also about peacekeeping, whereas this is about mostly focused on preventing any conflict. Now, looking at some of the recent issues, we coming from the new diplomacy, then Cold War diplomacy, then post-Cold War diplomacy, then what is the recent development? How has diplomacy changed? Now, let's talk about the first thing. The first issue is that the first target, supposing there are problems between two countries and the relations start deteriorating. So, the first target of deteriorating relations between the two countries are the diplomatic staff and the physical embassy. So, embassies, what happens as a result of this, all the diplomatic staff and the diplomacy and the diplomatic buildings or institutions, they are always in fear of interacting with the local population. So, they lose contact with the local population, and what they do is they build up a fortress type of embassy, that it's a fortress, nobody can enter, we will not go out. And this is what is happening because of the embassies being targets of the first order. Now, second issue which has come up especially since 1984, and let us take the Indian example, why go far, is about diplomats in danger. Whenever there is any relation problem between two countries, the first attack is on the diplomats to express your displeasure. Now, diplomats in danger, and the first example is of the Indian diplomat Ravindra Matre, who was killed in 1984 in Birmingham, UK, and this was because of the protest against the Kashmir issue. And then Venkateshwara Rao was killed in Kabul in 2008. Now, see, the repercussions were many. For example, in the civil services, the hierarchy of the UPSC services that are granted through the civil services exam, IFS would be the top most coveted service, and because of these aspects now IFS has slid down it to the third position. People would rather opt for IAS or IPS rather than IFS, whereas pre 1980s the position would be so different. IFS was the first choice of this civil service aspirants. Now, the third important thing was the 9/11 attack, and after that US started chasing Al Qaeda, and it wanted to target Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda would not take it sitting down. So, Al Qaeda started attacking US embassies in different places, especially the 1998 Al Qaeda attack on US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. The Benghazi controversy is the most recent. There were 11 attacks on US diplomatic outposts in Libya. And of course, the Libyan situation was different. Colonel Gaddafi was there and US was meddling, and he was not liking the US intervention. Then the most important recent development has been this phenomena called recalling diplomatic mission. And recalling diplomatic mission is a big issue. For example, in November 2012, as very recently, Canada he called back his diplomatic mission from Israel. Now, this had a big implication. It wasn't just recalling any embassy, it was a way of protesting. It was a means of diplomatic protest, and Canada wanted that Palestine should be given observer status and how to protest in the United Nations, and this was its method of protest, and this has bigger implications, the greatest implication in terms of United Nations. Now, the other recent trend has been diplomacy by expulsion. The trend is that some country unilaterally will take a decision that I am expelling 5 of your diplomats, and reasons cited could be frivolous, but the very fact that they have taken a country has taken a stand against the diplomatic mission of another country goes on to have a far-fetched implication. For example, in 1996, Soviet Union had demanded that 4 of the British diplomats in Moscow embassy should leave, and then Britain would not take it sitting down. Britain immediately reciprocated, same year it reciprocated by a tit for tat, and it also expelled 4 of Soviet Union diplomats. So, this is more of a vendetta kind of a situation. Then the other technique or other trend in recent diplomatic activity has been diplomacy by subversion. That is, you do not openly do anything in the name of your diplomatic mission in some other country. You are trying to influence the people, you are trying to force in your intelligence agency through the diplomatic mission, and you are trying to create a negative image of the host country's government. For example, the most important example, Salvador Allende's government in Chile, the US government was using this tactics of subversion. It wanted to, through the use of CIA and the use of other agencies, it was trying to bring down the Allende government, and it succeeded, because in 1973 Allende was finally ousted in a coup. So, this is diplomacy, the newest trends in diplomacy, but nonetheless diplomacy has a lot of contributions which we cannot belittle. The first is that, and I would like to conclude my lecture with this, the first thing is that diplomacy has a key role in foreign relations. You cannot deny that. Then it has comparative advantage. Pure diplomacy may not be as successful, but it has comparative advantage if it is used with other instruments like economic, social and subversion methods. Then it is sure shot to guarantee international peace. The traditional diplomats will not suffice. Therefore, the modern diplomats have to enhance their managerial skills in the complex system, because diplomacy is not an art anymore. And one thing must be borne in mind, that diplomacy on itself is not a panacea. It is not a cure for the ill. It only is a facilitator to help in curing the malaise. That is, it can facilitate cooperation, it can facilitate agreement, but it on its own cannot solve the problem. Then the other concluding point would be that the state-based diplomacy has been challenged due to globalization. With globalization, then the very aspects of states have been challenged. Therefore, the diplomacy which was state-based will definitely be challenged. Then another aspect which has redefined or has forced us to relook at diplomacy is the revolution in information technology. The communication revolution has totally transformed the process of diplomacy. And there's another thing which is very important, is that the ability of the actors to control the outcome has been diluted. Initially, when the diplomat would go, he would know that this would be the outcome and he can secure this outcome. But now, the ability of the diplomat to say that yes, I am going and I am going to negotiate and this will be the outcome, that has been definitely diluted. And then I would like to end by making two quotations which are very interesting. One person says that to say the nastiest thing in the nicest way is diplomacy. And Karki Stinnett, he says, a diplomat would ask you to go to hell in such a way that you really look forward to the trip. And this is actually the art which is diplomacy. Thank you.
Okay, as you said that outcome is not now sure by the actors what is going to happen after this much process followed. One thing, so given this things, how you see the diplomacy could work well in especially conflict-ridden zone, like where suppose India, Pakistan and other countries, US and Afghanistan. So here a specialized kind of democracy is needed, or we should follow the democracy which is in practice in recent times.
The diplomatic procedure has to be redefined. I was talking about track 1 and track 2 diplomacy. In the Pakistani case, Indo-Pakistan relations, we have started taking a recourse to track 2 diplomacy, but even that doesn't seem to be working.
Okay.
So I think it is more about also incorporating other channels, other aspects, like citizen diplomacy would be a great contribution according to me. Citizen diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, because we have to open, because those are the kinds of diplomacy which have more of people to people contact, and they can mobilize public opinion in the country, and because of that public opinion, then we can actually pressurize the government to reformulate their policies.
So it's about the changing public opinion or securing public opinion for particular issues. Complete general thinking, you can say, or the specific issues based is required.
You see, the existing public opinion is definitely there, and we need to change the existing public opinion, because if the existing public opinion was enough, then we would have had a solution to the problem. But there are certain misconceptions, there are certain perceptions which are not right. So we have to rebuild those public opinion. And as you know about the role of the world public opinion, that in the the Vietnam War, US and Vietnam were two different powers. One was a great power and then one was a very, very small power. But still, Vietnam War, US was forced to get, US was forced to get out of the Vietnam War, and in fact they had to face a defeat because of the public opinion in their own country which went against them. So if a US in Vietnam could face such a scenario, why can't, say for example, India and Pakistan?
Okay. So, well friends, with this word we conclude the lecture. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf I thank Dr. Aprajita Kashyap for giving such an insightful lecture on this very topic. Thank you very much.